we were going to do is we're going to sit and have a panel discussion up here, or a panel argument at any rate, and then we're going to throw it open to questions. We're going to do roughly 30 minutes up here, and then come back to all of you. So please think of questions that you want to ask. And the format which we decided, which is a mixture between my dictatorial instincts and the great culture of John Negroponte, is that we're going to follow the structure of Machiavelli, which apparently is first to do fear, then greed, and finally honor. Fear involves politics, greed involves money, and honor, we're not quite sure, but we will come across that at some point. But to begin with, in other words, we're going to talk about politics and then going to move a bit into economics and finance, and then honor being part of the integral parts of everything to do with what we've just discussed. On politics, I'm going to start by Doug and asking him, actually I'm going to start with John, in fact, and ask first, what do you think, I'm going to ask each of you very quickly to start off with, what do you think the biggest risk is in terms of politics? And John, do you want to go first, and then we'll come to Doug, and then Ian.
Well, the way I went about this as I was getting ready for this evening was to think, well, if I was the director of national intelligence still, what would I be worrying about? I don't think the menu changes that much. I tried to come up with a list of 10 threats, and you know what? I couldn't. I came up with 5, and the first was weapons of mass destruction. Proliferation, particularly with regard to North Korea and Iran, with Pakistan off on the side there, which is building up its nuclear capability. Counterterrorism was second, but mainly to U.S. interests abroad, not here in the United States itself. Third was state failure, ungoverned spaces, what Afghanistan was pre-9/11, what Somalia became, and now parts of West Africa and the Maghreb, and I guess I would ask myself, might Libya become one of these failed states? I think it's kind of a little bit precarious over there. And then fourth, I'd say generally Middle East stability, uncertainty, especially with regard to Egypt, the most populous country in that part of the world, and Syria, because nobody really has a clue what would happen if Bashar al-Assad were to be overthrown or to step aside, even though we all say we dearly wish that he would leave. And last, but possibly over the longer term, definitely not least, and that's cyber threats of many different kinds, including and that's the one threat that I think we really have to be concerned about here in our homeland.
Would you very quickly on that? China never occurred in that. That's not a.
What was it? Do I think that China?
Was China part of that, or where does China come into this?
Oh, as a threat. Well, I think of China as an opportunity. I think of it as probably the most important bilateral diplomatic relationship we've got, and that's got to be managed carefully over the next century. I think we've got to try to make it a positive-sum game, and I think we have to avoid making the hostility and enmity of China a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think that can be avoided. I was there at the beginning with Dr. Kissinger in 1972. I went with him to Beijing. I've seen it develop since then. I think we can channel that relationship in a constructive direction, but I think it's going to require leadership on both sides.
Great. We'll come back to Doug. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll take a different perspective maybe. I think one of the greatest, if not the single greatest threat politically, globally, is institutional failures on the broad global governance stage. So what I mean by that is we have a set of norms on the international stage that presumes a certain set of behaviors by the members that will try to get to a conclusion that is supposed to be for the betterment of the global public good, and they work together, and all is supposed to be consensus-driven and compromise-driven. And I'm not sure that that's what these institutions actually do today. And if they do them, they don't do them very well, because that's not really the motivations of many of the member states that participate. So whether it is the UN or the WTO or the IMF, or you can go down the list, these global institutions are not serving the world well. So what does that mean? It means you either continue down that route and fail, or you end up with an every nation for themselves, title of one of Ian's books, mind you, with that kind of a world where we can all agree that's not a healthy dynamic, or you end up with a different set of dynamics, a different set of regional agreements. In the trade arena, we now see that with regional trade deals taking the place of a WTO. You see that with economics where financial support is coming from regional financing arrangements, not global financing arrangements. And the risk embedded in that is that you have a big country that dominates whatever that ad hoc or regional alliance looks like, which is exactly what that global dynamic was supposed to avoid, at least avoid unless you were the United States, which meant you and the Western European powers post-war, 60, 70 years ago, could dominate those institutions. If you sort of take away that institutional framework, then that leads to a lot of uncertainty and a lot of what I would consider to be global risk.
Very quickly, do you think America is to blame for that?
Oh, no, certainly not to blame. I mean, you can certainly claim that America overplayed our hands in certain ways, but I do not in the least think this is an American blame game. I think that the institutions themselves were miraculous creations. If you had to create any of them today, you couldn't do it. You couldn't come close to doing it. So the fact is they were created in a set of dynamics post-war that don't exist today. We couldn't create anything even remotely like them now. And the US, while certainly not being the most flexible guy on the block, and we certainly want to maintain our dominance in our national interests, and I would certainly argue we could have been more flexible in certain ways that were more strategic, I certainly don't think you can blame the US. I think the institutions themselves are rule-bound, and the members have simply changed over time, and their interests have changed over time, and the institutions haven't changed with them.
Wonderful. Ian, plenty for you to disagree with.
I mean, look, I assume it's Israel-Palestine because that's where Secretary Kerry is prioritizing.
Yes,
right? I don't really, I mean, he is doing that. It's clearly not the top risk. I don't know why he's doing it. But it's sad, really. But when I think, look, I think there are 2 points here. The first point is that what the most important risk is depends a lot on where you're sitting, which is less true than it's much more true than it used to be, right? You think about the Middle East today. The Middle East is an enormously important set of risks, but not for us. And we need to recognize that. Iran goes nuclear if we don't actually get this deal done. It's a real problem for Saudi Arabia. It's not clear to me how much of a problem it is for the U.S. It really isn't. I know that we'd like it to be, from a humanist perspective. Syria is a horrible problem for Syrians. It is very clear that America does not view it that way, and isn't going to. It's a problem for Lebanon, it's a problem for Turkey. If I think about what the problems are for the United States, there are 2. They're pretty obvious. One is us. Right? I mean, to what extent are we capable of getting out of our...
Not on this panel. I mean, you just...
Well, no, I mean, we're definitely part of it. Not right now, but tomorrow we will be when we get back to our offices. I do my best at stirring this problem. I think that the United States, our inability to get out of our own way is a significant issue. What kind of an America we want to have and how we will address our governance issues, our security issues, our economic issues. I think that's an enormous risk for Americans thinking about the world going forward. And secondly, China. And China in part because we're at cyber war against each other, and John already referenced that. In part because the global institutions aren't functioning, and Doug already referenced that. But look, China's also engaged. They've done more economic reform in 6 months than we've seen in 10 years. On the one hand, that's great, right? They're finally addressing these issues. On the other hand, that's scary, because what if they start to actually mishandle it? What if it doesn't go well? This is the second largest economy in the world, and China and Japan hate each other. And that matters too. And the potential for conflict there, we don't pay much attention to it right now, but the Japanese do. And they're increasingly our most important ally in the world. The Brits have a special relationship, but they're not very relevant. Japanese are. I love the Brits. No, I do. I read The Economist every week, but they're not very relevant. But look, this is after dinner. This is what we do after dinner.
You're all nodding. It's terrible.
But the potential for conflict there is real. Anyone that read the fantastic New York Times piece this Sunday, New York Times, on the South China Sea, and they did really get it right, long form, which they rarely do, but they got it right this weekend. But they didn't mention Japan, China at all. I was stunned by that, because that, of course, is the much more important and relevant and immediate risk, and the one where both sides can take action against each other and get the Americans drawn in. So watching from New York, those are the two I would focus on.
Let's head into one of the ones which the ambassador mentioned first, which is cybersecurity. I mean, how much should we worry about that? Doug, do you have any views? I mean, is this just, or maybe the ambassador, do you want to elaborate a bit?
Well, okay, but I'm going to count on help from the others as well. My view is, first of all, this is sort of an unknown because, Leon Panetta said that we face the prospect or the possibility of a cyber Pearl Harbor. And when you look at the vulnerabilities of, say, our infrastructure, whether it's energy or our hospital system or our emergency response capabilities, law enforcement, so on and so forth, it seems to me across, given the fact that we've become so dependent on information technology, it cuts across the entire spectrum of our lives. So I just think that it's something where better defenses have to be developed. And probably I co-chaired a task force for the Council on Foreign Relations on the future of the internet. I think there's probably got to be more discussion at the international level, not only about the nitty-gritty of internet governance and so forth, but cybersecurity, the doctrine of cyber warfare, what's legit and what's not legit in the use of cyber weaponry, theft of intellectual property and all of that. Should we start building, one of the things our task force recommended was building protection of intellectual property from cyber theft right into our future trade agreements. I just think it covers just practically the entire range of human activity. So I think this is a question that's going to be with us for decades to come. And we're only beginning to appreciate the extent of the issue.
Ian, are you a hawk on cybersecurity?
Hawk?
A warrior.
I'm a warrior. Yes, I'm not a warrior. Look, I think, first of all, I think the cyber issue, the thing that concerns me the most, exercises me the most about cyber, is the impact it'll have on expanding what sectors are viewed as strategic, both in the U.S. and internationally. The fact that anyone that deals in data, not just Google or Microsoft, but MasterCard or AT&T, that if they want to do business in Brazil or in Europe or in other countries in the world, suddenly the regulatory environment's going to become much harder. They're going to be seen as connected to the U.S. government, the NSA. They don't get a lot of benefit from being connected from the U.S. government, the NSA. It's not like Chinese state-owned enterprises get from being connected to the Chinese government, but that is going to create fragmentation in the marketplace and trade flows, potentially in the internet. Jared Cohen and Eric Schmidt just wrote a very interesting book about the new digital divide that talks about geotechnology. And they expect one of the big risks in the world, the Economist wrote nicely about this book, and rightfully so, is that the internet is likely to fragment. And when the world's largest, soon to be world's largest economy is basically saying we don't want Google or Facebook or Twitter here. And then you have countries in the middle saying the NSA is just as bad as the Chinese, which I don't personally believe, John doesn't believe, but there's increasingly credible argument for it in third-party states. I think that causes a problem for all of us.
I should say that we had an argument at our table about what the difference was. Who would have the biggest effect on the lives we live out of Osama bin Laden and Edward Snowden, with the two, Doug and me on the bin Laden front, and the two in the middle on Snowden, who are obviously wrong, so maybe they could, maybe one of them could defend it, or maybe Doug, let Doug go first, because Doug who's right, can tell them.
Just one observation, which again I made, I think, at the table in the course of this, which is to say one of the points that I think is subsumed within what everybody's been talking about here is 6 months ago, even less than that, President Obama's biggest international agenda item with China, our most important diplomatic relationship, was supposed to be the U.S. beating the hell out of the Chinese for their inappropriate use of hacking and cyber technology. Remember that? Yeah. Right? That was the big deal that the president was supposed to raise with Xi Jinping. Right. And now the entire world is talking about the NSA and is talking about, quite frankly, the failures of the technology behind Obamacare and other items like that. And then the Europeans saying, well, we're not sure we're going to treat Google and Yahoo the way they want to be treated commercially, which has a huge commercial impact on companies like Google and Yahoo. And the idea that the Chinese are the bad guys for cyber warfare and hacking, we don't hear that anymore. That's a big shift in American foreign policy.
Ian, Joe.
I agree.
You seem to have deserted and gone onto their side, which is
No,
exactly
no.
what you...
No, because, but it will ultimately be resolved.
Yeah.
Because everybody does it. And because ultimately everybody doing it means there will be some agreement between the Europeans. You know, we have, I think, something called Five Eyes is a public thing where there are nations that cooperate and have agreements. There'll be things like that that ultimately get resolved, and we'll go back to some level of not talking about it. And it will happen over time. Right now, you can say Snowden's more important today, but over time, and I don't mean the long term, I mean the short to medium term, this too will go away.
So I never thought of the question before. So I mean, just kind of thinking stream of consciousness. And Snowden, yeah, you're right. If there's presentism involved in that, and maybe sort of that makes it more important for right now. But if I think about it, you think about Bin Laden, and Bin Laden suddenly was, well, there had been no threat to the U.S., a post-Soviet collapse, and suddenly it's all terrorism, war on terror, it's non-state actors, that's where we're going to spend our money, that's where we're going to focus. If we've learned anything over the last 5 years, the state is back. State is principal actor. Yeah, terrorism matters, but how much time and effort are we really going to spend on that, thinking about global security? Now we're focusing much more on both proliferation issues as well as cyber. What interests me on cyber is that for such a long time, when we thought about U.S. security, we thought about NATO, we thought about collective security, on nuclear, on basing agreements, on conventional strategy with our allies. When we think about cyber, we think much more about individual countries, every nation for themselves. We think about potential alignment with industrial sectors. We think about a very different type of conflict. And I wonder that in 10 years' time, will we say, well, that was a nice diversion, but we're back to states again and collective and allies? Or is this reflecting a tipping point? I fear this actually reflects a tipping point, irrespective of how well we come out on it.
Do you agree, John?
Yeah, but I was thinking that, I mean, if you think of Snowden as a surrogate for the broader cyber issues, it's because of that I came down on the side of Snowden instead of Bin Laden, because I think it's the ability to, through virtual cyber power, to wreak all kinds of havoc. I guess it's cyber terrorism versus terrestial terrorism, if you will. And I think the former can be much more devastating. Now, of course, if you take the extreme case, you can probably reach, a very high state of violence in either case. A terrorist gets a hold of a nuclear weapon, or the cyber terrorist manages to take down the whole electrical network of a country and the hospital system and the satellites and so forth. So pushed to their extremes, I think they can both be equally devastating. On the question of whether we're going to resolve this, I was Director of National Intelligence, and I was familiar with this Five Eyes arrangement, which we established some 50 or 60 years ago with Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And I think one of the things that the European countries would like to see us do is have a relationship sort of on that same kind of a level. And I think that's probably not a bad idea. I think it's something we ought to seriously consider, perhaps starting with NATO.
But what would be the conditions you would lay down for that?
Well, I mean, you have to have a discussion, but I think the first thing, the objective would be to get to a position where, at the very least, we're not eavesdropping on each other. Whether you then carry that cooperation further to other things, shared duties, information sharing, and so forth, that would be remain to be discussed. That still begs the question of what you do about non-allies. It still leaves Madame Dilma Rousseff in Brazil and President Peña Nieto asking questions. So unfortunately, once you get past no comment on intelligence matters, you're sort of on a slippery slope, and you're always leaving questions unanswered and maybe creating more questions than you were asked. But you got to start somewhere, and I think there's an acute political pressure to do that at this particular point in time. So I think we'll get past it, but we're going to have to work out some arrangements. And the last point I'd make is, I mean, we've got more important things to use our intelligence assets for. We've talked about them, the terrorism and WMD, and we actually need the collaboration of these other countries in order to share information and work with them to meet these threats. And it's kind of hard to do that when reports are coming out that you might have tapped their telephones.
Doug, does your international institutions, does that answer this at all or not? Or is it a symptom of the failure?
Well, it's interesting because what I was thinking as we were talking a moment ago is the Osama bin Laden and the Snowden, so the virtual cyber terrorism and the terrestrial terrorism. I was thinking as you were discussing it that you could have this sort of mutually assured destruction kind of knowledge between us and the Chinese, that we could hack them to death and they could hack us to death. But then I was thinking what really is the threat is the asymmetric nature of each of them, which is that small groups or even individuals, God forbid, could actually set off down either one of these paths and cause enormous damage along the lines of what John's alluding to. And that's the risk, is there's no international institutional framework that deals with the technology today, either in terms of actual weapons or cyber weapons, that don't fall under any institutional framework. They're not state actors. They're not covered by any treaties. They're not covered by any international agreements. How do you deal with that? That, to me, is the common thread that really takes all of these threats out from under our general paradigm of understanding how to deal with them.
I'm going to change the subject quickly to China, then we'll come on to the greed aspect. But just to give Ian something to argue with, it strikes me that maybe next year, actually, there will be a swing back in terms of power, back towards America. Is that on the economy, you see the Americans growing, if not as fast as the Chinese, certainly contributing more in a sort of in a total figure towards GDP than Chinese. You see the reappearance of American companies at the top of most of the lists of the most valuable ones on the one side. On the other time, in terms of government, yes, you've got the rotten Congress, but they've also got huge corruption scandals at the top. And I think some of the charm of China as an alternative to America in terms of democracy, etc., might begin to come apart.
Don't know.
You're looking very skeptical.
Well, look, I'm not a declinist. It's become fashionable in lots of circles to say the U.S. is in decline. The U.S. economy is not in decline. I don't see folks in Florida trying to swim them to Cuba anytime soon. Russians want to buy real estate here. Chinese want to send their kids to school here. People invest in equities here. People invest in treasuries here. It's not changing. But I think U.S. foreign policy and America's influence internationally is in decline. And I would not have said that 6 months ago. And that worries me. American exceptionalism is in decline. I mean, I don't want to see Obama using exceptionalist language going forth. It will be embarrassing. It won't work, right? The last 6 months have been bad for the U.S. on this. Syria, Snowden, shutdown. Just keep saying it. Syria, Snowden, shutdown. You can't do exceptionalism in that context. The Chinese can make hay out of that. Chinese growth, going down, sure, but 7.8% this last quarter, and a hell of a lot better than any of the other BRICS. Or most, Mongolia is doing better than them in growth year on year, but not many other emerging markets are. Xi Jinping, I think, is one of the most legitimately popular leaders in the emerging markets today, which is astonishing given that no one voted for him. He's accomplished more in 6 months than the previous regime did in 10 years. And again, look, Doug's right that
some of the stuff he's going to do next year is going to be, if he goes after corruption trials, things like that will send a message that China is much dirtier at the top than people immediately think it was.
I think we know how dirty China is at the top. I think the New York Times, Bloomberg, and others that aren't allowed to show their media in China right now have done a good job presenting that to the rest of the world. we understand the endemic corruption, but we also understand that things are working there, and there's an enormous amount of inefficiencies. And if Xi Jinping is able to take next month's 2 weeks party plenum and actually talk about, sort of actual timeline for land reform, registration reform, I think will actually be announced. It'll be meaningful. They start liberalizing issues like capital flows, which they're already doing in the free trade zone in Shanghai. I see hedge funds getting more excited about China now. China long-term is completely unsustainable on 30 different fronts. We know it, they know it. But 2014, how does China look? The U.S. economy is going to look fine, maybe not from the perspective of lots of unemployed Americans, but from a macro perspective, this room will like U.S. next year. We will too. But I think that China actually is a relative winner in 2014. There's just more risk. There's more hair around it. The final point here is on what Doug said. Doug said that one of his concerns on cyber is that there's no accountability on this mutually assured destruction stuff. If the Chinese start actually engaging in real economic reform, so they start pressing some of these SOEs that are not very efficient, if you've got a choice as an SOE of going under because you've been massively corrupt or using every possible lever at your disposal, which the Chinese central government might not like you to do, but you want to stay alive and you want your kids to stay alive and out of jail, you might use them. That's how cyber, I think, becomes a serious issue, right? Is that those folks are not going to have the level of, well, we want to gain advantage, we want to do industrial espionage, but we don't want to destroy anything. The Chinese government doesn't want to destroy us. That's very clear. But individual actors within the Chinese government over the course of the next 12, 24, 36 months might not hold that view, and some of them will be empowered. That worries me.
I think I do agree. I think the plenum is extraordinarily important, and we'll probably do it as a cover this week. Doug, do you have, are you a China fearer or a China?
Well, the one thing not particularly, again, partly because of the background that I had, having been there in 1972 and watched the process of the developing our relationship from the very beginning. I do think we must face the fact of life that they're the second largest economy in the world. They may one day or another become the first. We have this sort of nip and tuck race and prediction as to when that might happen, but I don't doubt that it will happen. I think the broader geopolitical question is, and it I think goes back a little bit to what Doug has been raising, is what are the implications of that for the world order? We've never had a world order, and Henry Kissinger likes to make this point frequently, that where responsibility was shared between sort of almost co-equal powers. And China and India were huge economies in whatever, the 17th or 16th centuries relative to the rest of the world, but they didn't play a global role as we understand it. First it was the Spaniards, and then the Brits, and then the Americans. And so the design of the new world order, I think, is going to be a very, very interesting issue over these next 10, 20, 30 years. And I don't think we've yet fully addressed it.
So I'm going to ask Doug to come in on finance and business, because we've kept on politics so far. Just take us through what you think is the biggest risk there, and then we'll throw it open to people here.
The biggest risk in the world in finance for next year.
It's an easy question to ask.
I guess I would say complacency. I think everybody assumes, so China's going to grow between 7.5% and 8%. IMF downside is 6.5%. So that's, within the realm of fine. Europe, crisis is over. We'll get to that. U.S., well, the political paralysis, debt ceiling, they'll get over that, et cetera, et cetera. We'll grow at 2.5%, 3%. Emerging markets, well, the Fed taper talk already happened. Now that's not going to happen. I think that this just the broad sense that we've reached this sweet spot where none of the real underlying problems anywhere have actually been solved. And yet we've all decided we did just enough to feel pretty damn good that we're at least better than we used to be a couple of years ago, and life is much more pleasant this way than it was when we were all worried about, what was going to happen in tomorrow's headlines or reform agendas across the world. And so to capture the broad umbrella fear It's that everybody assumes a relatively benign outcome of just about every economic region in the world, and I hope they're right. But in terms of risk, that's what we're talking about, that's a big damn risk.
I agree. No, I think it's great. We've got lots of emerging market elections coming up in 2014. Everyone that's major that has elections, the Chinese know, the Russians, they don't count. But the major because they don't really have elections, but the emerging markets that do are all having them. And you look at that and what that usually means in slowing down structural and sustainable policy reforms, combined with the potential of the U.S. Fed tapering. And you look at, I mean, if you were to ask me what's the part of the world that has the potential of exploding economically over the next 12 to 18 months that we're complacent about right now, it would be some of those sweet spot emerging markets.
Any particular ones? Is it Brazil?
Turkey.
Turkey.
Yeah. Their ability to do incompetent with Erdogan not wanting to give up on it. I mean, it is a fairly strongly institutionalized system with a leader that orients himself towards authoritarianism, and he's going to get voted out, and that doesn't bode well. And I worry about his willingness to do stupid. I mean, going after claiming that Soros is the reason for his problems. I mean, Soros is the reason for many people's problems, but not this one, right? I think that I worry that Turkey is a place that should be doing really well that will radically underperform because of what we're going to see. And the Kurdish ceasefire falls apart, and they've got serious Syria problems, and the money they've made out of Iraq is probably not sustainable. I don't like Turkey. You used to like where Turkey was located. Their neighborhood was great. Their neighborhood now is god awful, right? At the same time that you have this major transition that Erdogan doesn't want to see happen. And it's not just one election, it's a series of several over a year. I don't like what's going on there.
John, you just come back from Kurdistan. What's your view of that region?
Well, I mean, my concern, as I mentioned earlier, was really what happens to Egypt and Syria. I was very distressed at the way Mubarak was ushered out of power, and I'm not sure much thought was given to the consequences to the extent that we helped facilitate that happening, and I think that's a huge question mark, and we're going to have some very difficult choices to make.
Do you think he deserved a kind of Marcos thing where America could have come in and taken him out?
Well, I just, I've lived long enough and been in diplomacy now more than 50 years, and I've watched what's happened to some of these authoritarian leaders who were friends of the United States, whether it's the Shah or Diem. I served in Vietnam back during that period, or Somoza, or on and on and on, and they end up being treated quite ungratefully. In Egypt, I think the risk is particularly acute because of, first of all, their role in upholding the Camp David peace accords, and secondly, because no one really knows once you take that lid off what's going to happen. We had a taste of it with the Muslim Brotherhood, and now let's see what happens. But what I was going to mention was that I think that by way of difficult choices for our government, I think we're going to have to sort of hold our nose and support this military government for a while in the interests of stabilizing the Egyptian situation. Stability first. Democracy can wait. Charles Kupchan wrote a very good op-ed piece in Washington a few weeks back about that. And then, of course, the other big question mark is Syria and what's going to happen there. The talk about having to choose between evils, that is really a terribly difficult situation, because if Bashar al-Assad gets removed from power, I'm almost certain that there'll be a high risk that the Muslim Brotherhood or the Al-Qaeda will have huge influence in that country.
Doug, we're thrown open to questions after this, but Doug, do you want to say something about, particularly from an economic viewpoint, on the whole Arab Spring? Because one of the risks which I endlessly look at is when you look at countries like Egypt, the economies just stink.
So traditionally, the world believes that countries like Egypt, at a time like this, when they've plowed all their reserves at an unparalleled pace, that the IMF comes in and the U.S. and European allies can basically say, all right, we're going to throw some money at Egypt and we're going to do what the IMF does in these circumstances. But there are countries, and Egypt is one, in which they are so far gone that their economic condition doesn't warrant IMF involvement. They just can't get their act together. Now, that doesn't mean it won't happen. It means that countries like Egypt need to take some basic economic steps along the lines of what the IMF and the so-called Washington Consensus, before that became a bad word, or words, what they would recommend. And the thing is, Egypt has no willingness or ability to do that at all. So what's happened instead, and Egypt is the perfect example, is a country that we all believe is strategically very important, whose economy is wildly fragile, that is running out of money every month. And instead of going to the IMF, or having a US Treasury that has these pockets of secret cash, which, by the way, don't exist, even though a lot of countries like Egypt and those in the Middle East believe they do. They just keep waiting for the US to come up with something secretly and send a couple of billion in, and it doesn't exist, and we're not doing that. So what does that mean? It means Egypt survives now by its friendly neighbors providing them with monthly stipends to survive. And of course, countries don't do that just for the hell of it. They do that because they expect something in return, very strategically. And that is really an interesting dynamic where certainly the US has lost a lot of strategic heft because we're not providing the money and we're not convincing the IMF to provide the money. So the countries that are providing the money, somebody's keeping track. And I think that that's a strategic, if not a risk to the US, certainly a strategic dynamic that we have to understand plays into countries like Egypt, and it's not just Egypt. Because after a conflict is over, whether it's in Syria, no matter how it ends, their economies are devastated. And you've got to figure out how to rebuild. And we as a country don't have the money anymore. And the tools, again, back to my institutional failings again, those institutions simply aren't set up to deal with these situations. So what do? We end up either having a backseat or we're chiming in from outside. And you all have to question who's going to step in to fill that vacuum. And it might be the Saudis, it might be the Chinese, it might be others that are cash rich. So whether you're the largest economy in the world or not on the basis of GDP, per capita, total, nominal, PPP, that's not relevant. The US doesn't have cash to spend, and a bunch of other countries do. And that's actually a strategic thing we have to think about.
Let's go for questions. Do you want to put your hand up and just say who you are and then ask? I think there's one back there.
Hello?
Speaking.
I can speak up. So Stanislav McLarty, Citigroup. Two questions, if I may. First one is, in the great tradition of referencing what the Economist covers, I think the battered line with a lot of wings kind of comes up, and it begs the question of, is the West really weakened temporarily or permanently, and is it a process that is reversible? And I guess second question on Russia and what role that is going to play in the world system, from hosting Snowden to emerging with a plan to save Obama, which is kind of unfeasible in Economist's view. What is Russia's role going to be in the world arena going forward?
Ian, do you want to take the West first, and then maybe John, do you want to say something about Russia?
Okay.
I was going to say something about Russia, actually, if you don't mind.
You're invading every...
Well, I mean, Eurasia group, right, historically. What is... Putin's had a few good months, but Russia hasn't. Russia's pretty irrelevant in this environment. Putin won Snowden. Great for them. They won Syria. They won Assad. I mean, is this a portfolio you want to put together? The Chinese got Snowden right. Bring him over, grab his data, send him on. Russia's like, oh yeah, we want some of that. Oh, we've got no one to send him to now. We're stuck. Not good. I think the Russians have acted out of insecurity, pique, and arrogance. I think Putin, has systematically undermined the institutions around him. I do believe he's the most powerful single human being in the world today. I think it's been true for a few years now. That has not been to Russia's benefit. And so Russia plays the role as an occasional spoiler, and certainly as a country that has the ability to cause real instability near its borders. But beyond that, their throw weight is pretty limited. And if you think about the fact that what they really do well is energy, and you look and gas, and you look at what's happening with those prices globally over the long term, I think these guys are pretty screwed, pardon my French. So I worry about that. I don't think the United States is, as I said, a wounded lion economically. I do think the U.S. is in decline from the perspective of the bottom 50% of American earners, and has been for several decades, and there's nothing that's going to change global inequality impacting the U.S. on that front. Technology is probably going to worsen it, not make it better. But the U.S. still has extraordinary strength. The reason why the U.S. screws up so much is precisely because we have so much rope to hang ourselves with, much more than any other country in the world. This stuff does not impact us very much, right? That's why we can keep getting it wrong. If this were happening in another country in the world, things would be desperate. That doesn't make me very optimistic about getting the politics right, but the ability of the United States to continue to drive extraordinary innovation, world-changing innovation, I don't think is impacted much by dysfunction in Washington, and I think that most investors around the world actually get that. So,
John, Joe.
Why don't we go to another question?
Okay, another question. There's one in the back.
That covers it pretty well.
There's a lady behind you afterwards as well, I think.
Okay, Bob Young with Lulu. I don't know how to ask this politely, so you've convinced me to put all my money in my mattress. What's the risk that you Cassandras are wrong and the world actually gets better and I miss out on huge opportunities as a result of none of your risks coming to pass and the world actually improving?
Doug, why don't you give that?
So first of all, when you have a title of a panel about risk, and in which the moderator asks each of us to talk about our biggest risks.
It's all my fault, in other words.
No, but that should not have you all leave and think that we're all, I can speak for myself, thinking that the world is just one big risk and that you ought to put your money in your mattress. Certainly that was not the premise of my remarks tonight. So I would argue that yes, the risk that I described of complacency is born of an inadequate but probably better than expected response to a lot of the economic and financial crises that we saw over the last 5 years. So the response was actually okay. Europe has done better than most people, certainly in this country, felt it would. China, everybody's been talking about China blowing up for a long time, and their economy, if the downside is 6.5, yeah, I mean, that is a real downside for China. But that doesn't mean China's in negative growth. I mean, the emerging markets, yeah, they actually probably benefited from the fact that when the words taper came out of Bernanke's mouth back in May, and their whole paradigm shifted, they actually now have bought some time to figure out what to do about it. So actually, we've kind of seen some mediocre, suboptimal responses, but there have been responses. So I certainly wouldn't leave tonight and say the world is just one big risk waiting to happen, at least not from my perspective on economic and financial issues.
I would certainly agree with that. And if you look at it geopolitically, there are entire regions of the world that we used to worry about quite a bit that we don't worry about particularly much at all anymore. Take the Western Hemisphere. We used to live in terror of the situation in Cuba and the war in Central America and things like that. And I'd say the atmosphere in this hemisphere is really quite benign. The East Asia region generally, some of the problems with China and Japan and Korea notwithstanding, it is a very healthy situation. Southeast Asia is back on the uptick, so I think there's as much good, if not more, to point to. And then I'd like to echo what Ian said about us. I mean, I think we're still got a political and economic system that is the envy of many countries in the world.
And if you look at the bed bug epidemic in New York, your mattress is not a safe place.
We come up with concrete suggestions on this panel. There's another question. Sorry, there's one.
You've been waiting for that opportunity for a long time.
Hi, my name is Leah Costello from Canada, and I first of all wanted to say we've been trying to get your attention down here for like hundreds of years, and I think we finally have, because I understand it was a Canadian company that screwed up your Obamacare website. We apologize, but if you let us build our pipeline, we will fix the cyber threat to your to your site. Anyway, I recently hosted the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, and interestingly enough, learned more about China from him than I did about Israel. And I'm curious to know, his perspective on China is that the great thing about the way that they go out in the world is that they don't actually think about anything except for the money and the economic opportunity. Whereas his comment on Westerners, and particularly America, is that the way that Americans go out is that everything is a cause, and everything is kind of tied up in a cause, and where we invest and what we, how we position ourselves from foreign policy perspectives has more to do with that than just making money. Is that a clear distinction that you would agree with or not?
Ian, you can come in.
Yes and no. I think that the Chinese are very bilateral, in part because they're smaller. So when they're bilateral, they're bigger than everyone, and they can tend to get better economic deals. The U.S. is more multilateral consensus builders, though the U.S. has to lead the consensus and determines values. Certainly much more economic focus. The problem with China and its economic focus is because it's small and because it has values and priorities that the West doesn't like, its portfolio has also been bad. So if you look at what countries China has real capture of, and its economic is really dominated and they can make political outcomes that it likes, Cambodia, Laos, North Korea. And in North Korea it hasn't worked out so well. Beyond that, maybe Pakistan and Myanmar, but Myanmar is running away from China really fast, and Pakistan, the Chinese don't want it because it's a problem for China. The other countries where China is really dominant economically or plays a really significant role are countries that are pretty authoritarian, pretty brittle, and sufficiently corrupt that the West doesn't want to or can't invest. Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, Sudan, or countries that politically have such a bad relationship with the West that they desperately need something with China. Syria, Venezuela, Iran. Again, put them all together. Not a great, I'm not saying that you are arguing that they were winning this way, but I just think the presumption is that when the US screws up, that China just eats everything. Actually, the places where China really has influence are not places that are, if anything, it's a vulnerability for China. I think as we look out longer term, 10, 20 years, places where China 10 years ago played no role and now they have a seat at the table because of economics, Germany, Indonesia, Australia, Saudi Arabia, others, that's interesting. And if China can get it right, if they can engage, if the plenum goes well coming up next month, and if they continue to grow and they don't have massive internal instability and they don't have a huge fight with the United States and the West, we don't have cyber wars and all the rest, China in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, might actually have real influence on the basis of those economic relationships that actually create something that matters internationally. We are not close to that right now. So I just think we need to, for a snapshot right now, we need to show where, and Doug's point that absent the US, these institutions don't work, a big part of that is precisely because the second largest economy doesn't have that throw weight internationally.
We'll just end by I might take 3 questions. There's one here and there's 2 at the back there. And then if you all ask your questions very, very quickly, I'll then ask the panelists to grab one of them and answer it, and then we'll end with that.
John's first risk was nuclear and then Iran, and Ian mentioned that he didn't see Iran as a major threat to the U.S. And just curious, I assume part of the complacency may be North American energy increasing self-sufficiency, but I'm just wondering kind of how you guys reconcile that, and it's obviously top of mind for a lot of people.
Okay, Iran, there was 2 I pointed to at the back, if they could be very quick.
Hi, Samantha Azzarello, CME Group. I'm just wondering, speaking of energy, if you can comment on how political dynamics are going to shift, given that the U.S. is going to be more energy independent, and who potentially could be policing the Middle East, for lack of a better phrase.
And one more.
Is the United States going to approve the Keystone Pipeline?
Okay, I'm going to give Iran to John.
Well, I'll start with Iran.
Energy to Ian, and then.
But I guess what I'd say is, first of all, the concern is a general non-proliferation policy concern. It's been a factor of American foreign policy for 30, 40 years to try to limit the number of countries who hold nuclear weapons. We've had some successes, not all of them are that well known. Countries that did not go nuclear that might have done. We're more conscious of the ones that have, such as India, Pakistan, and so forth. I think the real complicating factor vis-a-vis Iran is that if it gets nuclear weapons, then what happens in the Persian Gulf and amongst the Arab countries? Are you going to have some kind of an arms race? And I think that could just compound the stability issues. I think it's true that it's not a direct threat, at least not in the short term, to the United States, but it's certainly an indirect one. And to the extent that we have an interest in stability in the Middle East, I think it's very, very important.
Do you want to quickly disagree?
Well, yeah, I think if Iran gets nuclear weapons, Israel might. And then who knows what's going to happen. Then I'm like, all bets are off at that point. Yeah. I'm sorry, I was giving you help. No, the Saudis will.
The
They've got a
Saudis
pack, and the
will.
Saudis will, but that's probably it.
Turks
Look, I don't
might.
like it. I don't like it, but if you ask me, am I more concerned about Iran getting nukes or Pakistan getting nukes? I'm more concerned about Pakistan getting nukes. And that already happened, and we didn't care very much. And then we got rid of sanctions against them because it didn't work. So I'm just saying we'll deal. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm just saying it doesn't matter much for us if we're not thinking globally, and we're not. So on energy, look, Doug was really credible on Egypt and who's policing Egypt. It ain't us. He gave you a lot of detail there. He's really inside it. He knows this stuff. Who's going to police the Middle East? The Middle Easterners are going to police the Middle East. Is that going to work? You've got to be kidding me. And it's not because they're stupid. It's because they have very different perspectives from each other. Right? I mean, Saudi Arabia and Iran and Qatar and Turkey and Israel and the Kurds, who will at some point be more autonomous and eventually independent, those guys have very radically non-aligned views of how one might police the Middle East. Good thing we have an energy revolution in the United States. China is going to be more exposed to that. China just told the Iraqis last week they want to increase their uptake in oil by 70% next year. They want to get to 850,000 barrels a day. They're going to do it again the year after, I'm sure. It's all going to be China. But they're not going to create a multilateral, organization to create peace in the Middle East. This area is going to blow up. And, I'm very sad about that. This G0 world that I like to talk about is very bad for the Middle East. There's no question.
Got the title. Doug. You might do Keystone on the way.
I was going to say, if you're throwing me Keystone, so we end this day and this panel with me saying I have no idea. It's not a good way to end the panel. So
go for one of the other
I'm
ones.
going to say on Keystone, I have no idea. I don't think that there's a decision that's been taken. Clearly, you hear things both ways. And if there were a decision taken, I'm not saying that we'd all know it yet, but my strong belief is that this president, this White House, this Congress, at this point in time, have a lot of other things going on. And although Keystone is certainly part of the broad partisan, rhetorical dysfunction that is Washington today, I don't know how it ends up. In order to end up with something other than I don't know how it ends up, I'll just pick up on the first part of what Ian was getting into, which was about the energy dynamics. And he talked about the Middle East. But I do think from an economic perspective, the fact that we've got this energy revolution in the U.S., the fact that we are now on our way towards energy self-sufficiency, it's somehow distinct from energy independence, but nevertheless, let's call it energy self-sufficiency, has created a really positive dynamic. It's created more economic optimism in this country. It's created more economic optimism about this country. It's created arbitrage in the energy markets that allows manufacturing in this country to actually have a cost benefit. It has allowed trade deals to suddenly become spurred on by the fact that we have special trade relationships with countries that allow us to export our energy without additional permitting by Washington. So a lot of things that emanate from this energy revolution are sort of influencing not only strategic things, not only regional things, but just the way the U.S. economy is working, the way trade agreements are working or will hopefully work. So I think it's a much bigger deal than those who look at any individual slice of the energy revolution. I think it really has changed sort of the way people look at the country, and that's probably a pretty good thing.
That seems a very good way to end. Is The Economist, we don't have many concepts of honor, but what we believe in fervently is free trade. So somehow Doug's managed to drag it back to honor at the end, or as close as we're going to get to it. I'd like to thank Mark and our friends at RBC again. Thank you very much.